Good afternoon. If you'll forgive me, my title in the programme says mission, or it has the word mission in it. For the purposes of time today, my only mission is getting out of here before the building is locked, so my paper is slightly more confined. But my name is Wray, and I have recently submitted my PhD in history at Queen's University Belfast. My collaborative doctoral project worked alongside National Museum's NI's historic photographic collections. Well, my thesis focused on the work of Belfast photographer Alexander Hogg in recording everyday life in the city. Through my research and consequent doctoral placement, I also explored the museum's wider photographic archives and their lantern slides. Over 1,000 lantern slides are held in National Museum's NI collections, dating from the 19th to early 20th century. Most take the form of 3.25 square inch slides like these. They are glass plates. The sources are far from simply visual ephemera from the period. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, magic lantern shows gained popularity in Britain, Ireland, and throughout the Empire. The magic lantern, also referred to as an optical lantern, was an early image projector. In their earliest forms, they had been entertaining audiences since the early 1600s, but new forms of illumination increased their popularity as time progressed. Limelight and kerosene in the 19th century, and by the 20th century, obviously, electricity. These developments improved the effectiveness and safety of projection, widening the audiences and locations these shows could reach. While their invention predated photography, photographic lantern slides became some of the most popular forms of images projected on these devices. As we draw to the end of a conference, when nearly every presenter has supported their papers with slides, as is custom, we acknowledge the cultural legacy and historical significance of the lantern slide, which should not be minimised. Lantern shows were a means of both entertainment and instruction, reflective of societal and cultural views, trends and ideals, particularly for the middle classes. In an instructive manual entitled The Book of Lantern, published in 1888, the author wrote, "The magic lantern has always been one of the most popular instruments ever made. So popular it has been that children by the thousand recognise its charms, while many of more mature years have a hankering after it. But let me say at once, the magic lantern is no toy, but is recognised as a valuable aid to education far and wide." But many of these educational lantern slides were, in the words of James Ryan, framed by empirical concerns. This is apparent from observing those held in National Museum's NI's collections. Some take the form of commercial slide sets. These, made by the company Winter, are prime examples. They range from those showing hand-painted portraits of key military figures, to Britannia grieving over the tomb of King Edward VII, to a key lesson in any child's education on empire, the illustrated history of the Union Jack. The presence of these slides in National Museum's NI's collections situates the popularity of empirical slides in the north of Ireland within wider practice of slide viewing in Britain. These slides were not unique, but commercially successful shows whose popularity extended also to Ulster. There are, however, slides that provide unique insight into visualisations of empirical concerns in an Irish context or relating to Irish themes. This slide, for instance, shows the distribution in Ireland during the Cromwellian conquest, while the other shows it during the reign of King Henry VII. Others present notions of Irish types, such as this colorised cartoon of drunk Irish Pat being reprimanded by a policeman, which often uses highly racialised language and visual imagery that was commonly used towards Irish at the time. But this afternoon, in the brief time I have, I want to focus on slides that appear less empirical in character, but I believe cannot be viewed without considering how empirical concerns are embedded in their construction and circulation. They were taken by a trio of photographers in the north of Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th century. You'll probably have heard of them before: R.J. Welsh, W.A. Green and A.R. Hogg, on whom my PhD was based. All three photographers were unlike many of their vocational peers during the period, as they did not confine their work to studio portraiture, but also made their living in part by taking photographs of Irish landscapes and rural scenes. A number of slides created by these three men have ended up in National Museum's NI's collections, but in many ways, we could say that this is where their story began. They were part of a middle-class social milieu from the period, and thus members of various interconnected societies, such as the Ulster Amateur Photographic Society, Belfast Naturalist Field Club, Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society, and Belfast Municipal Museum and Art Gallery, which, in the words of Jonathan Wright in yesterday's paper, the Ulster Museum is an institutional descendant of. The creation and content of their slides was shaped by the very circles that influenced the organisation in which these slides are now held. The range of themes covered in these slides taken by these men is broad. This is no surprise, given that their portfolios were extensive, and Hogg, in the middle, also advertised himself as a lanternist and was thus making slides for a wide range of people. However, a large number record what we can describe in its broadest terms as Irish cultural life. Take a series created by Green, for instance, entitled Irish Cultural Life. Take a series created by Green, for instance, entitled Irish Country Life. This collection recorded rural customs at threat of extinction. Another series by R.J. Welsh entitled The Evolution of the Irish Car contains a couple of images which clearly record Irish types. Justin Carville has written in great detail on the ethnographically inflected images of this trio of men. For Carville, their collective endeavour in photographing the antiquities, material culture and rural customs of Ireland suggests a common sense of purpose in, quote, the formation of a vast visual archive that preserved the remnants of the region's antiquities and rural customs. Carville has discussed the tensions between regionalism and nationalism in the work of these three Ulster Protestant men who had interest in Irish Celticism, yet, for instance, all are recorded as signing the Ulster Covenant. Carville continues that the pursuit of photographing culturally salient subjects by societies that had experienced a rupture in the connections with their past corresponds neatly with those post-colonial situations in which photography has been mobilised towards ameliorating a sense of cultural disposition from an Indigenous history. As, quote, visual archive of historical objects and customs is not only rooted in the anticipation and preservation of rescue material objects and cultural forms that are perceived as disappearing, but also in a sense of continued connection to past through the photographic image. This is all the more relevant for many of the slides which were created post-partition. Building on Carville's own observations, which were made regarding the larger photographic archives of these men, I want to argue that lantern slides should also be considered within the context they were intended to be viewed. Firstly, these men would have been familiar with lantern slides of national or regional customs from further afield that were rooted in colonial understandings or had racialised undertones. All of these three men at some point were connected with Ulster Amateur Photographic Society. One example taken from 1902, a Captain W. Gelston of the West African Frontier Force delivered a lecture entitled 12 Months in Lagos and in the Hinterland, using 120 lantern slides to show native industries, customs, scenery and countryside, etc. Slides of a very high, quote, order are taken from negatives Captain Gelston secured in many instances at risk of his life. It also says the roads were not the same as at home, being even worse than the Lisburn Road, so that's saying something. Hogg, Welsh and Green's slides of Irish types, customs and industries must therefore be situated within the practice and pattern of visualising otherness. Secondly, however, I would also like to propose that lantern slides should not be seen as static visualisations. Their interpretations were malleable and could be engaged with by a variety of ways. Discussing eviction slides, which were commercially made by the Lawrence Studio in Dublin, Emily Mark Fitzgerald comments that audiences of these slides were remarkably diverse politically, socially and geographically. While widely adopted by Home Rule campaigns, Mark Fitzgerald explains they were also shown during unionist meetings and openly mocked as to their veracity. While the rural customs and scenes recorded by Hogg, Welsh and Green are less politically loaded, I believe that these slides, many of which were also commercially available or widely circulated, have the same malleability, as these visualisations could be shaped and appropriated by lectures and discourse which they were used alongside. The Irish ethnographic lantern show could be used as a tool to by Northern audiences to understand their past, presents and futures. These identities could be in keeping or at odds with empirical concerns. It could be an identity that was rooted in a particular cultural heritage or understood itself as apart from it. So what is the place of lantern slides in National Museum's NI collections, and how are they being engaged with? Fortunately, many of these have been digitised and are now widely available to online audiences. However, I believe that they should also be situated in the context in which they were intended to be viewed, the negotiational spaces of lantern shows. Lantern shows were spaces in which images could be viewed within wider discourse to negotiate and create notions of identity and historical pasts. They thus seem like perfect tools for us to negotiate many of the complex and conflicting narratives we are confronted with today as we do the same. This includes the place of empirical concerns in Irish museums' collections. While Berger suggests if we can see the present clearly enough, we shall ask the right questions of the past. In the case of the lantern slide, if we see the complexities of the past, we will hopefully ask the right questions of the present. Thank you.